1971, 19-year-old Una Lynsey disappeared near her home in County Meath. And in the weeks that followed then, and on flimsy grounds, Gardaí identified 3 young local men as suspects. Well, now, Mick Clifford, who's special correspondent for the Irish Examiner, has written a book called Who Killed Una Lynsey? And in it, he has built a compelling portrait of the case from interviews with the surviving main players through access to the files of a private investigator who uncovered information that the Gardaí missed or ignored. And Mick joins us now on the line and on Zoom. Mick, good afternoon to you.
Hi, John.
Now, 1971 or the 70s, I remember them. I'm guessing maybe you do as well. But they were a very different time, and in particular, our attitude to authority. We'll get to that. But let's go back first of all to that October day. Una was from Ratoath.
Yeah, sorry, just before I do that, just you mentioned 1970s. 1977 was the year my family actually moved to Donegal, and I spent 4 of my formative years up there. So it's very nice to be on Highland Radio. I have to say, I have fantastic memories of
Whereabouts in Donegal?
I lived in Donegal town for 4 years till I was 16.
Oh, brilliant! Right. Well,
Won a few county vocational schools football medals with the Abbey Vocational School too while I was up there.
Oh, good. Good on. Well, I'm glad that you have good memories of the place. Anyhow, so let's from there to County Meath to Ratoath, where Una was from, and she was coming home from work.
That's right. She was, John, I suppose just to put it in a small bit of context, a thing I wasn't aware of until I began writing the book, this organisation, the Land Commission, they were charged, one of their main programmes in the 30s and 40s was bringing people from the west of Ireland, particularly Mayo and Galway, over to the east on the basis that they were on holdings, congested holdings as they were called in the west, that were unviable. So the government offered them under this programme to effectively relocate them to Meath and Kildare. And one of the holdings that the government bought that had split up among all these people coming from the west was in Porterstown Lane, just south of Ratoath, which is precisely where Una Lynsey lived with her family. So the point I'm making is they were a very tight-knit community. All of them, all these young people whose parents had come over from the west, and to this day there's parts of Meath that still has Gaeltachts, and those Gaeltachts originate in those people who came over from the west. So it's just an indication of how tight-knit the community was. Anyway, Una was coming home from work with her cousin and Gahan. She was working in Dublin, ironically in the Land Commission office. She got a job there. She got off the bus. Anne was living just down the road from where she got off the bus. They said goodbye. Una set off across Porterstown Lane. The walk should have taken her between 10 and 15 minutes, and she never arrived.
Okay, so then there was a search that was started and an investigation started, and within a very short space of time, the murder squad arrived down from Dublin.
That's right, and the murder squad is central to everything that occurred thereafter. I should point out there was a strange car driving around the area around the time Una disappeared, and there was a description from a number of locals who had seen it of a driver, and some of the descriptions had a second individual in the car. Some only had one. It would seem that early on the murder squad, discounted those sightings and came to the conclusion the 3 local lads, 2 of whom were also from that displaced community from the west, so they were very tight-knit. They all knew Una. They'd been responsible. In fact, they'd been driving across the lane from the far side. The lane was about 1.5 miles long, about 15 minutes after Una disappeared. But that timing wasn't accepted by the Gardaí. They believed they may have encountered them. They took a number of statements. They brought the 3 lads into Trim Garda station. There is an awful lot of circumstantial evidence that the lads were assaulted in custody. 2 of them produced what you might call bits and pieces of a confession suggesting they had met Una. The bits and pieces didn't make any sense. There was no narrative. And crucially, if they had met Una, there was nothing there that suggested they knew where she was, where her body was, or where she was, or whatever. So one way or the other, at that point, Una's family were certainly given the impression by the Gardaí that these three neighbours of theirs were responsible. A lot of hassle began in the area between the extended Lynsey family and people, these three lads and some of their friends. Then 6 weeks later, Una's body was found in the Dublin Mountains, 40 kilometres away. Within 10 days, the youngest of the three lads, Marty Kerrigan, was kidnapped by two of the Lynseys and their first cousin, brought up to Dublin Mountains late at night, and he was killed. So we now had two deaths in this close-knit community, and two trials followed. And the crucial element is all of the evidence, and subsequently was found to be the case in terms of any legal proceedings. The three lads were innocent. They had never met Una that evening.
Let's go back to the murder squad, and they were sort of stars within the Gardaí, because even though the Gardaí at the time were years behind their colleagues in other parts of Europe, but they had the technical knowledge, and you could do fingerprinting and ballistics and all the rest of it. But they insisted on sticking with these three suspects, and that was what they, despite all the contradictory evidence or statements, they stuck with the three.
They did, and one significant element to this case is it was the first in which a pattern can be discerned throughout the 70s and 80s, when a group loosely associated with the murder squad, which came to be known as the Heavy Gang, there was numerous allegations of abuse in custody, assault in custody, in efforts to get confessions through that unit. Now, a couple of these cases have become notorious down the decades. One is the Salins mail train robbery, which saw 3 people convicted. Ultimately, Nicky Kelly was jailed. All of them subsequently were They took actions against the state. They were awarded compensation in one form or another, but there was never a proper investigation. The most famous case, and there are a lot of parallels, and I draw this in the book, is a lot of parallels with the Lynsey case, is the Kerry Babies case. And there we had a scenario whereby a family of 4 adults admitted to the murder of a baby, to bringing that baby out one peninsula in Kerry, such that the currents would bring the body across the bay and be found in another peninsula. All of it fiction. They had never driven out anywhere. They didn't kill any baby. None of it was true. Yet they'd all confessed to a greater or lesser extent to this in custody. That was never properly examined. There was a tribunal, but it set out to examine how that could have happened. It examined something completely different. So there was a pattern with these things. And the other thing, I suppose, is fair to say, John, it has to be put in context. This was against the background where, as you said, because with such low crime rate in this country, the Gardaí were very much behind their counterparts in Europe in terms of policing. And then in the late 60s, early 70s, the North explodes. Suddenly they find themselves in a conflict, particularly with the IRA, with the professionalism that the IRA had, their ability with forensics, their capacity to intimidate witnesses. So it would seem, and I've certainly been told this by people around at the time, even within the Gardaí, that a loose group said they'd take it into their own hands. They would get confessions for various crimes, and ultimately that culture spread beyond anything to do with politics. It was completely wrong anyway and completely illegal. But the likes of the Lynsey case, the Kerry Babies case, had nothing to do with politics or the North. And that culture ended up targeting very innocent people. And these 3 lads were among those. And the real tragedy here was that one of them lost his life as a result.
And what happened after that? What was the outcome?
After that, the 2 Lynseys and John Gahan were put on trial. They were convicted of manslaughter rather than murder, which is a fascinating outcome. And I do this in the book as well, because medical evidence was heard at the trial, which was not disputed, that Marty Kerrigan had suffered a wound to his groin area, which is believed to have been an attempt to disembowel him. And the pathologist said that that was inflicted after death. Now, despite that, the 3 lads said that when they left him, he was alive and they only meant to frighten him. The jury convicted him of manslaughter. They got 3 years in prison. A few months later, the 2 surviving guys who'd been targeted by the Gardaí for Una's death were put on trial. They also were convicted of manslaughter. They also were sentenced to 3 years. One of them, Dick Donnelly, who hadn't made any admissions in custody, got off on appeal. Didn't get off, sorry. His conviction was overturned on appeal. There was very flimsy evidence to do with them anyway. And it was 35 years later before, with the help of the private investigator you mentioned earlier, Billy Flynn, before Martin Conmey, the second man, was able to go back into the Court of Criminal Appeal, have his conviction overturned, get a certificate of miscarriage of justice, and he was compensated by the state for the time he had to spend in prison.
Um, is it true to say that there's now a cold case review, but that it's the Gardaí that are looking into it?
Yeah, the Gardaí have opened a cold case review. They had a press conference last year on the 50th anniversary of Una's disappearance. Look, I'm sure they'll do their best. There's some very awkward questions they'll have to address, but the chances of finding out at this stage who the perpetrator was, you'd have to say are slim. No, that's not to take away. It could well turn out there may be some trump card that the Gardaí have. DNA is highly unlikely, but you'd never know. But that cold case review is on one way or the other at the moment. And an important element too is Marty Kerrigan's family, his siblings, who are all in their late 70s into their 80s now. They want some acknowledgement that when he died, he was a murder suspect, and that's the reason he was killed, and that was wrong, that the Gardaí should never have had him down as a suspect because the evidence simply wasn't there, and any confession he made was made purely because he was abused in custody, he was assaulted in custody.
And just going back to the car, the strange car that was spotted, a fancy Ford, as you outline in the book. I'm not familiar with them. A Ford Zodiac, is that right?
Yeah, I wasn't either. There were two models. And actually, I only discovered the other day, believe it or not, there used to be a program, I think it was on BBC, Z Cars. And it was only the other day someone told me that the Z there refers to those two models, a Zodiac and a Zephyr. There were Ford models that preceded the Granada, I think, and perhaps the Cortina. They stopped being manufactured in 75, but they were pretty big Ford models. Those were the type of cars that were at the centre of it.
Right. And obviously the sort of car that would stand out. But anyway, that particular angle wasn't followed up by the Gardaí. They had their three suspects, and that was it. So to this day, we don't know who killed Una Lynsey, and there is a cold case review. There's no senior counsel or retired judge involved, but we'll see what will come of that. But in the meantime, it's a fascinating account, not just of the murder and the investigation, but everything also around the edges, around the fringes, and the sort of the era that it was, and a real focus on the murder squad as well. All in this book, Who Killed Una Lynsey. Mick Clifford, it's been a pleasure. Best luck with the book. It's been a pleasure chatting to you.
Thanks very much, John.